the day my father was buried. I inherited a piece of land so worthless. My brother laughed when the lawyer read it out loud. He got the house, the business, the accounts, everything my father built over 40 years. I got dirt, literally a barren piece of land in the middle of nowhere. No value, no development, nothing. My brother clapped me on the shoulder after the reading and said, "Don't worry, maybe you can grow potatoes." Everyone in that room smiled. I didn't, because while they were busy dividing what my father left behind, I was already thinking about what I was going to build. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in my father's eyes. It wasn't something anyone said out loud. It was just understood. My father built a construction company from nothing. 40 years of work, long days, early mornings. The kind of man who believed respect was earned through effort and loyalty. And to him, loyalty meant one thing: family business. My older brother James understood that from the start. James was the kind of son my father liked. Practical, predictable. He studied business in college, came home right after graduation, and started working with my father the next Monday. My father loved that. You could see it in the way he talked about him. James has a good head for this. James understands how things work. James will take this company further than I ever did. It wasn't jealousy that I felt growing up. Not exactly. It was more like distance, because I knew pretty early that I wasn't going to follow the same path. I liked different things. I was curious about different work. I wanted to build something that belonged to me, not step into something that was already built. My father never said I couldn't do that, but the silence that followed every time I mentioned my plans told me everything I needed to know. I remember one dinner when I was about 20. James had just finished his first year working for the company. My father spent most of the meal talking about a large contract they had landed. Roads, infrastructure, something big enough that he was clearly proud of it. Then he looked at me. "So what are you doing these days?" The question sounded casual, but the way he asked it, it wasn't curiosity. It was evaluation. I told him about the small firm I had started working with. Not construction, not anything related to the family business. Just a modest job that gave me room to learn. He nodded once. Then he turned back to James and continued the conversation like I hadn't spoken. Mom tried to smooth moments like that over when she was alive. She would ask me questions, show interest, balance the table so it didn't feel like I was sitting on the outside of my own family. But she passed away when I was in my mid-20s. After that, things became quieter. My father and I were polite with each other, respectful even, but we were never close. And I made peace with that long before he passed away. Some people think every strained family relationship is filled with anger. Ours wasn't. It was just two people who chose different lives and stopped trying to change each other. James stayed with the company. Over the years, he became my father's right hand. The person he trusted with decisions, contracts, hiring, expansion, everything. By the time my father reached his 70s, the company was already running through James most of the time. Meanwhile, I built my own career slowly. Nothing flashy, just steady work, careful decisions, a quiet life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Family gatherings were predictable. James and my father would talk about the business. I would listen. Sometimes my father would ask what I was working on. Sometimes he wouldn't. It stopped bothering me years earlier, because the truth was, I didn't need his validation. I had chosen my path, and he had chosen his successor. Everyone in the family understood that. No one said it out loud, but we all knew how things would eventually play out. When my father passed away, it wasn't sudden. He had been slowing down for a while. James handled most of the company operations by then. Doctor's visits became more frequent. Phone calls between my brother and the office happened constantly. When the call finally came that my father had passed, it felt less like a shock and more like the closing of a long chapter. The funeral was quiet. A lot of employees came, people who had worked for him for decades. They shook James's hand, told him they were ready to keep the company moving forward. No one needed to ask who would be taking over. That part was obvious. A few days later, we met at the lawyer's office. Just a small group. James, myself, two distant relatives who had helped my father occasionally with paperwork, and the lawyer who had handled my father's affairs for years. We sat around a long table while he opened the folder containing the will. I remember the room being very still, not tense, just formal. The lawyer began reading through the details. The house, the company, the accounts, the investments, every major asset my father had built over 4 decades. Went to James. No one in the room seemed surprised. In fact, one of the relatives nodded like it made perfect sense. Then the lawyer turned to the final page. And to his younger son, he paused for a moment. He leaves the parcel of land located outside Red Valley County. I remember blinking once, because I had no idea what land he was talking about. The lawyer continued, reading a short description. A single piece of property. No structures. No development. Just land. James leaned back in his chair and let out a small laugh. Not cruel, just amused. Well, he said casually, I guess Dad wanted to make sure you got something. A couple of people at the table smiled awkwardly. The implication was obvious. Everyone in the room assumed the same thing. That my father had left me a piece of land that wasn't worth much, just so I wouldn't technically be left out of the will. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply nodded, signed the paperwork that confirmed the transfer, and left the office quietly. At the time, I honestly believed they were right. That the land was nothing more than a symbolic gesture. A small, almost dismissive reminder of the distance that had always existed between my father and me. But a few weeks later, curiosity made me look it up, and that was when things started to get interesting. At first, I only looked up the land out of curiosity, not because I expected to find anything valuable, just because it was mine now. The documents from the lawyer listed the location as a parcel outside Red Valley County. I pulled up the county property website one evening and typed in the parcel number. A map came up. The land sat far outside town limits. No nearby neighborhoods. No buildings. Just a patch of brown surrounded by empty terrain. Exactly what everyone in that room had assumed. Barren land. Still, I kept looking. The parcel was larger than I expected. Not massive, but not small either. A decent stretch of open ground. I zoomed out on the map, then zoomed out again. That was when I noticed something that made me pause. About 2 miles east, there was a new road cutting through the desert. It hadn't been there in older satellite images. The road connected to a highway that had recently been expanded. That caught my attention. Infrastructure projects rarely happen without a reason. So I started digging a little deeper. County planning websites aren't the most exciting places to spend your evenings, but they contain a lot of information if you're patient. Zoning plans, infrastructure proposals, transportation studies. Buried in one of those documents was a mention of a future development corridor tied to the new highway. Nothing finalized, nothing widely announced, just early-stage planning. But the corridor ran directly through the area surrounding my land. I leaned back in my chair that night, staring at the screen. 2 miles away wasn't far, especially not for large-scale development. Still, I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. Plans change. Projects get canceled. Land stays empty for decades sometimes. So I didn't tell anyone. Not James. Not relatives. No one. I simply kept researching. Over the next few weeks, I read every county document I could find. Meeting minutes. Zoning proposals. Transportation plans. A picture slowly started to form. Red Valley was growing. Not quickly, but steadily. The new highway expansion wasn't random. It was designed to push development outward over the next 10 years. Commercial zones, industrial lots, housing. Most of it was still on paper. But paper becomes concrete faster than people expect. One detail stood out more than the rest. A small section of land, almost exactly where my parcel sat, had been marked in an internal proposal as a possible mixed-use zone if expansion continued. Possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. That word stayed in my head for days. Because land values don't change when projects are finished. They change the moment people believe something is coming. I drove out to see the property a week later. The trip took about an hour and a half. The road eventually turned into gravel, then into something closer to dirt. When I reached the coordinates, I parked and stepped out of the car. The wind was strong that day. Dry air, open sky, nothing around for miles except scattered brush and distant hills. If someone had dropped me there without context, I would have said the same thing everyone else did. Worthless. I walked across the ground slowly. No utilities, no structures, just quiet land stretching under the sun. But when I turned and looked toward the east, I could see the new road cutting across the horizon. That thin strip of pavement changed the entire picture. Because roads bring people, people bring businesses, businesses bring money. And once that cycle starts, land stops being empty. It becomes opportunity. I didn't celebrate. I didn't assume anything. Instead, I went home and kept working through the information one piece at a time. The first step was zoning. The land was currently marked as agricultural use. That alone made it look worthless to most buyers. But zoning can change. It just takes patience, paperwork, and the right timing. So I contacted the county planning office. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet phone call asking about rezoning procedures. The woman on the line sounded bored at first, then slightly more interested when I asked specific questions about development corridors. She explained the process in simple terms. Application, review period, public notice, county board vote. Slow but possible. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there for a long time thinking about something my father used to say when I was younger. Most people lose money because they talk too much. He said about business deals, about negotiations, about timing. And strangely enough, it was the one lesson from him that stayed with me the longest. So I decided to follow it. I didn't mention the land to James. Not during family dinners. Not during occasional phone calls. As far as he knew, I still owned a useless patch of dirt that our father had thrown into the will as an afterthought. Meanwhile, I started the rezoning process quietly. Paperwork, meetings, more paperwork. Months passed, then a year. Nothing moved quickly, but it moved forward. And during that time, something else began happening in Red Valley. Construction crews started appearing closer to the highway. New survey markers, utility planning, small signs that the county's possible development corridor was slowly becoming something more real. I watched it all from a distance, carefully, patiently, because the land my father had left me was starting to look very different than the land everyone laughed about in that lawyer's office. And the best part was, no one in my family had the slightest idea. The rezoning process took longer than I expected, almost 2 full years. At times it felt like nothing was happening at all. Applications would sit for months waiting for review. County meetings would get postponed. Documents would need revisions over minor technical details. But that kind of delay didn't bother me. I had already built my life around patience. And patience is a strange advantage, because most people simply don't have it. About 6 months into the process, the first real sign appeared that things were changing. A logistics company purchased a large stretch of land about 4 miles from my parcel. It didn't make headlines, just a small note buried in a local business article. But projects like that don't happen in isolation. They happen because someone already knows infrastructure is coming. Within the next few months, more small transactions started appearing in the county records. Developers buying empty parcels, surveying companies mapping land near the highway, utility companies filing expansion permits. None of it directly involved my property, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Red Valley wasn't just planning to grow. It had already started. Meanwhile, my rezoning request moved through the county review process step by step. I attended exactly one meeting, not to make a speech, not to push anything aggressively, just to sit quietly in the back of the room while the planning board reviewed proposals. Most people there were developers or investors. You could tell by the way they spoke. Fast, confident, always looking 5 years ahead. When my parcel came up for discussion, the room barely reacted. To them, it was just another application among dozens. A request to shift agricultural land into a flexible, mixed-use classification. One of the board members asked a few routine questions. Was there road access? Yes. Environmental concerns? None identified. Nearby infrastructure plans? Possibly expanding east with a highway corridor. He nodded, wrote something down, and the conversation moved on. 2 months later, the rezoning was approved. I remember receiving the letter in the mail. Plain envelope. Standard county formatting. Nothing dramatic. Just a formal notice confirming that my land was now classified as mixed-use development property. I set the letter on the table and stared at it for a while, because that single change transformed the value of the land more than anything else could have. Agricultural land in the middle of nowhere is cheap. Development land near an expanding highway is something entirely different. But I still didn't rush. The next step was finding out what the market actually looked like. So I contacted a commercial real estate agent who specialized in land sales. I didn't mention the inheritance story. I didn't mention my brother. I simply said I owned a parcel outside Red Valley and wanted to understand its potential value. He drove out to see the property a week later. A man named David. Practical. Calm. The kind of person who had spent years negotiating land deals without getting emotional about them. We walked the property together under the afternoon sun. He asked questions. How long have you owned it? A few years. Any utilities connected? Not yet. Zoning. Mixed use as of 2 months ago. That was the moment he stopped walking. He turned toward me slowly. Mixed use. I handed him a copy of the county approval letter. He read it quietly. Then he looked out across the land again, this time with a very different expression. You realize, he said carefully, developers are already scouting this entire corridor. I shrugged slightly. I've heard. He walked another 100 yards before speaking again. You're sitting right in the path of expansion. Not guaranteed, not immediate, but right in the path. We finished the tour in silence. Before he left, David asked one final question. Are you looking to sell soon or hold long term? That was something I had thought about many times already, because by that point, I understood the basic truth of land value. Timing matters more than anything. Sell too early, and you leave money on the table. Sell too late, and the opportunity passes. So I asked him a question in return. If you were in my position, what would you do? He thought for a moment. Then he said something simple. I talk to a developer before the rest of the market wakes up. Not an open listing. Not public advertising. A quiet conversation. Because when developers see opportunity early, they move quickly. And when they move quickly, the numbers start getting interesting. I thanked him for the advice. Then I drove home that evening with the same calm feeling I'd had through the entire process. No excitement. No rush. Just the quiet understanding that something significant was about to happen. And the strange part was, while all of this was unfolding, my brother was still running the company our father left him, believing he had inherited everything that mattered. And I was still the son who received the worthless piece of land. The moment David said the words, talk to a developer before the rest of the market wakes up, something in my mind shifted. Until then, I had been researching, watching, learning. Now it was time to move, but quietly, because land deals, real land deals, rarely happen in public. They happen through conversations most people never hear. So the next step wasn't putting up a for sale sign. It was finding the right person. David helped with that. Over the next few weeks, he reached out to a few contacts he trusted, developers who specialized in expansion zones. Companies that bought land years before projects became visible to the public. Not everyone was interested. Some said the area was still too early. Others were already committed to different regions. But one company responded differently. A mid-sized development group based 2 counties over. Their representative called me personally. His name was Mark. His voice had the calm confidence of someone who had closed a lot of deals. I've been reviewing the zoning change on your parcel, he said. Mind if I come take a look in person? We scheduled the visit the following week. That morning looked a lot like the first time I had visited the land. Dry wind, endless sky, dust rolling across the ground. Mark arrived in a pickup truck with two other people from his team. They carried tablets and printed maps, the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from experience. They didn't talk much at first. They just walked the land, measured distances, checked the road access, compared the property lines with their development plans. I stayed a few steps behind them while they worked, listening, watching, learning. At one point, Mark stopped near the edge of the parcel and looked out toward the highway corridor. "You know what's coming out here," he said without turning around. It wasn't really a question. "Eventually," I replied. He nodded. "Warehouses first. Logistics. Then retail once traffic builds." He turned back toward the land. "This piece sits right where expansion pressure will push." Again calm. Matter of fact. No excitement. Just observation. We walked another 20 minutes before heading back to our cars. That's when the real conversation started. Mark leaned against the truck door and folded his arms. "So," he said, "are you looking to develop it yourself or sell?" "Sell," I said. He nodded slowly like he had expected that answer. "All right, then let's talk numbers." There are moments in life where you feel time slow down slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to make you aware that something important is happening. This was one of those moments. Because until that point, everything had been theory, research, possibility. Now it was becoming real. Mark explained their interest clearly. They wanted control of the parcel before competing developers started pushing into the corridor. Owning key land early gave them leverage when the area began filling in. And my land happened to sit in a very convenient location for their long-term layout. He made the first offer. I didn't react, not because I was shocked, but because I had already prepared myself for that moment. When you negotiate land, the first rule is simple. Never rush your response. So instead of answering immediately, I asked a few practical questions. Closing timelines, survey requirements, utility planning, details that signaled I was serious without revealing how I felt about the number. Mark answered everything calmly. He had clearly done this many times. Eventually, he looked at me and said the thing negotiators always say when they want a reaction. "That's a fair price for land in this area." Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But fairness isn't what determines value. Timing does. And I knew something he couldn't be completely certain of yet. The corridor was still early, but momentum was building. So I thanked him for the offer and told him I needed time to think about it. No pressure, no theatrics, just patience. Over the next 2 weeks, David quietly spoke with two other developers. Not to start a bidding war, just to confirm the direction of the market. Both companies expressed interest. Both numbers came in higher than the first offer. When I met Mark again for the second conversation, the tone had shifted slightly. He knew other buyers were circling. That changed things. Land negotiations don't need arguments. They just need silence in the right moments. Mark increased the offer, significantly. Still calm, still professional. But now there was urgency under the surface. I listened, asked a few more practical questions. Then I told him something simple. "If we can finalize this quickly, I'm willing to move forward." He nodded once. We shook hands. And just like that, the plan I had quietly built over 3 years started moving toward its final stage. The strange part was, during all of this, my brother still had no idea what was happening. To him, I was still the son who walked out of the lawyer's office with a worthless piece of land. And in a way, that misunderstanding made everything easier. After Mark and I shook hands that afternoon, nothing about the land felt theoretical anymore. For 3 years, it had been quiet research, paperwork, patience. Now, it was turning into an actual transaction. The first documents arrived 2 days later. Purchase framework, due diligence terms, closing schedule. Mark's company moved efficiently, which didn't surprise me. Groups like that don't waste time when they believe land will become valuable. Still, I took my time reading everything. Every clause, every timeline, every responsibility attached to the deal. Because once you sell land like that, you only do it once. David sat with me during the first review meeting. He had the relaxed posture of someone who had seen hundreds of these contracts before. "They're serious," he said after scanning the offer again. "And the number reflects that." I nodded. I had already understood something important by that point. The number on the page wasn't just payment for land. It was payment for timing. Developers don't buy empty ground for what it is today. They buy it for what it will become 5, 10, sometimes 20 years from now. And the earlier they secure it, the cheaper it is compared to the future. That's why Mark's company wanted the parcel before the rest of the corridor started moving. The moment other developers began competing for nearby land, the entire area would become more expensive. So the next phase began. Surveys, engineers, environmental checks, people in reflective vests walking across the property with equipment that looked complicated enough to launch satellites. I drove out there once while they were working, watching them move across the same ground I had first visited alone years earlier. Back then it had been silent. Just wind. Now there were trucks, tripods, voices discussing drainage plans and traffic flow. It was strange seeing the land treated like something valuable, because for most of its existence it hadn't been. Mark called a few times during that period. Short conversations. Professional. Mostly updates on progress. Survey looks clean. No environmental issues. Road access confirmed. Each piece of information moved the deal one step closer to closing. At one point, he said something that stuck with me. "You held this land at the right time. Not lucky. Not accidental. Right time." And that word, time, was exactly what had made the difference. Because if I had sold it the month I inherited it, the price would have been almost nothing. If I had waited 10 more years, maybe the price would have been even higher. But the market window that existed at that moment was strong enough to change my life. And that was enough. The final purchase agreement arrived 3 weeks later. A thick document with more legal language than anyone enjoys reading. But buried inside those pages was the final number. I remember staring at it for a moment longer than necessary. Because even after months of negotiation, seeing it written there felt different. Real. I signed the documents at a small office downtown. No celebration. No champagne. Just attorneys reviewing paperwork and confirming dates. Closing was scheduled for 30 days later. 30 quiet days. During that month, life continued exactly the same way it had before. I went to work, paid bills, had dinner, talked to family occasionally. James called once about a family gathering. We spoke for about 10 minutes. He talked about the company, a new contract, a few employees they had hired, business expansion. I listened, asked a few polite questions. At no point did the land come up. As far as he knew, it was still the same worthless inheritance everyone had laughed about. And I never felt any need to correct that assumption, because this had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was just a quiet opportunity that happened to fall into my hands. Closing day arrived almost without warning. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of ordinary weekday that doesn't feel like it should carry life-changing events. I drove to the title office around 9. Mark and his attorney were already there. So was David. Everyone shook hands, sat down, opened folders. The next hour passed in the slow rhythm of signatures. Initial here, sign here, date here. Every few minutes, another page would slide across the table. No one rushed. No one made speeches. Deals like that are handled with calm professionalism, not excitement. Eventually, the final document was signed. The title officer made a call to confirm the transfer. Then she looked at her computer screen and gave a small nod. Funds have been released. Just like that, the land was no longer mine. And the account attached to my name now held more money than I had ever imagined having. I didn't react outwardly. I thanked everyone for their time, shook hands, walked out of the office. The sunlight outside looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Traffic moved normally. People walked past without realizing anything unusual had happened, which felt appropriate, because the real value of that moment wasn't excitement. It was quiet security. the ability to make decisions without pressure, to build stability that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Over the next year, I handled the money the same way I had handled the land. Carefully. Most of it went into long-term investments, diversified funds, real estate partnerships. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just steady growth. I kept working, kept living the same way I always had. And during that entire time, no one in my family knew. Not James, not the relatives who had been in the lawyer's office that day. To them, the story had ended 3 years earlier. James inherited everything. I inherited nothing of value. And for a long time, that version of the story remained untouched. Until one afternoon, when someone in the extended family happened to look at the public property records. And suddenly the phone started ringing. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't answer it. Unknown numbers usually meant spam calls or wrong numbers. But something made me pick it up anyway. The moment I said hello, I heard my brother's voice. And he was already angry. You sold it. No greeting. No question. Just that sentence. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window for a moment before answering. Yes. There was a pause, the kind that happens right before someone loses control of their temper. Then the shouting started. How long have you known about this? He demanded. How long were you sitting on that land? I didn't answer right away. He didn't need the timeline. But he kept going. 3 years, right? You had that land for 3 years and didn't say a word to anyone. His voice kept rising. I could hear movement on the other end of the call. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Papers shifting. Then he said something that made it clear how he had found out. Uncle Robert showed me the records. That made sense. Property transactions are public. Eventually someone was going to notice. I had to look it up twice, he continued. I thought it was a mistake. I still hadn't said much. That seemed to make him even angrier. Do you know how much that land sold for? He said. Another pause. You knew, he said again, quieter now, but more intense. You knew what that land was worth. I rested my elbow on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, the same quiet I had grown used to over the years. Yes, I said. The response landed like fuel on a fire. You should have said something, he snapped. To who? I asked calmly. To the family, he said immediately. To me. The word me hung in the air for a moment. Then he continued. Dad would have wanted that land handled properly. It should have been part of the business, part of the family assets. That part almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, just because it was predictable. 3 years earlier, everyone had assumed the land meant nothing. Now that it had value, suddenly it belonged to the family. I kept my voice calm. Dad left the land to me. That's not the point, James said quickly. The point is you knew something the rest of US didn't. I didn't interrupt. He kept talking. You sat there while I was running the company, handling everything, and you never once mentioned that the land could be worth that kind of money. There it was. The real frustration. Not the land itself, but the fact that the story had changed. For most of our lives, the roles had been clear. James inherited the business. I built my own life somewhere else. Now something had shifted, and he didn't know how to process it. Look, he said finally, his tone trying to shift into something more controlled. That kind of money changes things. It affects the whole family. I stayed quiet. Then he said the line I had expected since the call began. You should share some of it. Not demand. Not exactly, but close enough. I took a slow breath and looked back out the window again. The street outside was calm. A couple walking their dog. Someone pulling into a driveway down the block. Ordinary life. James, I said, Dad divided his estate the way he wanted. That land was part of that estate. He replied immediately. Yes, I said, and he left it to me. There was silence on the line. Not peaceful silence. Tense silence. Then his voice came back louder. You're missing the point. No, I said gently. I don't think I am. The anger came back full force. You're acting like this had nothing to do with the family. In a way, I said, it didn't. That only made him more frustrated. You know what Dad would have said if he saw this? He snapped. I thought about that for a moment. about my father sitting at the dinner table all those years ago, about the quiet distance that had always existed between us. Then I said the only honest answer I had. I'm not sure he would have said anything. That stopped him, just for a second. Then the frustration came rushing back. You think you're clever, he said. That's not it, I replied. Another pause, longer this time. Finally, he asked the question that had probably been sitting in his mind since he first saw the property records. How much? I didn't answer. Instead, I said something simple. If you want to understand what happened, check the public records. Silence. The same sentence I had used earlier in the call, because the information was already there. He didn't need me to explain it. You're serious? He said. Yes. Then the anger came back again. Louder. Faster. A stream of accusations about loyalty, about family, about what our father would have expected. I let him talk, because sometimes people just need to empty the frustration out of their system. Eventually, he ran out of things to say. When his voice slowed down, I spoke again. I hope the company is doing well, I said. That caught him off guard. What? The business, I said calmly. I hope it's growing. He didn't answer, because deep down we both understood something. He had inherited exactly what our father wanted him to have. The company, the legacy, the responsibility that came with it. And I had taken the one thing that was left to me and built something from it quietly. No competition, no revenge, just two different outcomes. Take care, James, I said. Then I ended the call. He tried calling again later that evening. I didn't answer. Over the next few weeks, a few relatives reached out. Nothing aggressive, just curious questions. How did the land turn out to be valuable? Did you know about the development plans ahead of time? I always answered politely, but briefly. Yes. No. Just timing. Eventually the calls stopped. Life moved forward. James continued running the company. Family gatherings became less frequent, but still polite when they happened. There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontations, just distance. And honestly, I was fine with that, because the truth is, I had made peace with my father long before the land ever became valuable. He had built something he believed in, and he left it to the son who wanted to carry it forward. I never needed that role. The land he left me may have been meant as an afterthought, maybe even a quiet insult. But in the end, it didn't matter why he left it. What mattered was what I did with it. And 3 years later, that turned out to be more than enough.